I've always kind of scoffed at the idea of pattern cooldowns, but for years I've heard that if you're farming patterns, you should swap characters if you find a blue or purple pattern, because ESO will block you from getting another for a certain length of time. The problem is, no one seems to agree on what the cooldown timer is between patterns. I've heard on YouTube that greens and blues have no cooldown, but purples do. I've read that blues have a 10-minute cooldown or a 15-minute cooldown. I've heard everything from a 30-minute cooldown on a purple to a 24-hour cooldown. Surely with this much discrepancy, it's just RNG, right? The RNG for a purple pattern is just so low that they naturally space themselves out, and the rest is just gamer voodoo. Actually, no. On stream, my community and I figured out that green patterns actually have a 10-minute cooldown. We noticed a pattern and several of us tested it. We tried farming non-stop and compared the times between green patterns. Sure enough, they were all somewhere between 10 and 13 minutes without a single one showing up before the 10-minute mark. Huh, okay. So next we tried farming until we got a green pattern, then stopping, sitting on our hands for 10 minutes, then farming again. I mean, is there actually a 10-minute cooldown, or does it depend on how many containers we loot in that time? Our conclusion? It does not matter how many containers you loot in that 10 minutes. You can farm a green, pause for 10 minutes, and almost immediately pull another green pattern. Then I noticed another trend. Green recipes also had a 10-minute cooldown, independent from the timer for patterns. So while I was farming, I realized I could expect to get both a green pattern and a green recipe every 10 minutes or so. It was time to give this an honest test. For science. First, as expected, I got a green pattern about every 10 minutes or so. It's pretty apparent after 8 hours that there's a 10-minute cooldown and then RNG takes over. So you'll get another green pattern sometime after the 10-minute mark. And since they're pretty easy to get, it shouldn't take you that long after that 10 minutes passes. And again, I also got a green recipe roughly every 10 or so minutes. But we knew all that. So what about blue patterns? Well, the same thing, except with an apparent 1-hour cooldown. Every hour and some change, I was getting both a blue pattern and a blue recipe. And I made another discovery. I was also getting a blue motif every hour or so. So now we have 3 separate blue 1-hour timers. One for patterns, one for recipes, and one for motifs. Fascinating, right? All right, now the biggie. What about purple patterns? Well, if green patterns and recipes have a 10-minute cooldown timer, and blue patterns, recipes, and motifs each have a 1-hour cooldown timer, then we can probably safely extrapolate from that information that purple patterns, recipes, and motifs all have the same cooldown timer as well. If we can find a second of any of these, we can learn something about the cooldown timer of all of them. In other words, theoretically, if we can learn the cooldown for a purple recipe, then we also know the cooldown for a purple pattern and vice versa. However, while I looted a purple pattern and a purple recipe within my first hour of farming, I did not get any other purple anything during my 8 hours of farming. So I feel relatively comfortable saying that the cooldown is probably at least 8 hours, but I can't tell you for sure how long it is. Sorry, 8 straight hours without breaks was my absolute crazy pants limit. Although, admittedly, I'm sorely tempted to attempt this again and not stop until I get another purple of each. Would you guys be interested in the results of that? If you would, be sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments. So while I can't tell you what the cooldown timer is for purple patterns, what I can tell you is that you should probably just change characters after getting a purple, which is what they've been telling us all along, right? Whether you also change characters after getting a blue pattern is up to you, but for sure after a purple, since I can almost guarantee you won't get another one within 8 hours. If you're going gung-ho with the pattern farming, and you cycle through all of your characters and have gotten a purple on each one, when can you go back to character number 1? I honestly have no idea. My best guess is either 20 or 24 hours, but it could be as low as 8 hours since that's where I stopped. If you find out, please share, and if you get screenshots, I'd love to see them. And while I believe that we can extrapolate the purple patterns, recipes, and motifs will all have the same but separate timers, since they're likely to follow the pattern we found with greens and blues, there are some things I don't believe we can extrapolate. I only tested loot from containers. In my 8-hour farm, I only looted items from containers that were not stealing, but I have tested this in shorter bursts with containers that are stealing. My entire 8 hours was spent in High Isle, but I have also tested this on a smaller scale in base game zones. What I did not test was loot from killing mobs, or pickpocketing, or treasure chests, or quest reward coffers. These may share a cooldown timer, or they may have their own separate timer. Very, very limited testing seems to indicate that they either don't have a cooldown or they have their own, but I haven't gathered enough of my own data nor seen anyone else's data to support this. Speaking of, let's share the data I did collect, shall we? I ran the add-on loot log for the duration of my farming, and here's what I found. As you can see, we have a bunch of white patterns. They don't seem to have a cooldown. But we do have green patterns 10 or more minutes apart, and you'll see a blue pattern about every 6 green patterns an hour or more apart. You'll see that I got a purple pattern and recipe right towards the beginning, with no more to be found during the 8 hours of farming. You'll see a couple other purples at the beginning, but notice those are a different character, so they don't count because they all have separate timers. And again, if we isolate the recipes here, you see the pattern a little bit more clearly. Now, if you were wondering if we're sure that this cooldown is by character and not account, first you saw the couple purples that I got on a different character, and then immediately got purples with the new character. But here also, you can see that we have 2 blue patterns only 8 minutes apart after changing characters. So changing characters will absolutely help you avoid that 1 hour cooldown on blues and whatever the cooldown is on purples. I hope that puts to rest some of the cooldown questions you might have had. I know it did for me. Happy farming.